to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz. We have a great show set up here for you tonight. It is December 2nd, 2022. I'm here as always with Dmitry Kalugin, as well as a fantastic guest, author and documentarian, Dean Arnold. Dmitry, how are you?
I'm doing wonderfully this week. It has been a very eventful week. In fact, on Twitter, on the social medias, I know it's been almost a Cold War in itself, and mostly even on the American front. But yeah, so far we've had some interesting news that we've picked up along the week just to speak to you guys about. And yeah, we have a wonderful guest here today with us, Dean Arnold. And Conrad, would you like to introduce our new guest to the audience?
Yeah, as I said before, Dean Arnold is an author documentarian. He's written his most recent book, Unknown Empire, covering Ethiopia and the Arc of Civilization. And, he has been there multiple times. He's, of course, has a storied career of writing and journalism and documentarianism and, covering history and all sorts of fantastic topics. So, Dean, how are you this evening?
I'm doing great. Great to be with you. My stage name, my author's name is Dean W. Arnold. I put the W in there. My regular name is Dean Arnold, and at church I'm known as the Reader Gabriel.
That's wonderful, and I have this image of you, Dean. So every time I watch an interview with you or read some of the excerpts from your book, for example, I always come up with this image of saying a modern Indiana Jones. Is that a correct way of viewing you? And even throughout your sort of storied career, like traveling to Africa, exploring, speaking with the locals, like
Yeah,
investigating.
there's a little bit of that. Not, I mean, just a little bit in terms of like going to Africa and that sort of stuff. And I went out to England to write a movie script or two. In spirit, I'm kind of an Indiana Jones kind of guy. I've done some journalistic enterprises, and I've taken on the powers that be, and I've done some other things like that. So there's a little bit of truth to that, but I wouldn't go too far.
Well, we're big fans, and I would encourage everybody to follow him on Twitter, of course. Dean Arnold, you'll be able to find him on our pages. We've retweeted and shared his content. But let's we've got all sorts of things to talk about, whether it's crazy, Alex Jones, Kanye West interview, as well as things going on the ground in Ukraine, as well as actually this might not be as much on everybody's mind, but things are going on in Ethiopia. And we have Dean here, a Ethiopia expert, if there ever was one. And so, Dean, if you maybe want to introduce your book, what your experience with Ethiopia is, and maybe kind of talk about why it's relevant to, Christians today.
Sure. Let me just start by saying, uh, man, I'm trying to get my book in front of Ye. It's the perfect book for Ye, aka Kanye, um, because it deals with authentic Black identity. It deals with ancient Christianity in Africa. It deals with Orthodox Christianity. Ye calls himself Orthodox. It has several chapters about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood and the genocide of the Black community via abortion. Those are things Kanye talks about. It talks about who are the true Jews. It talks about the Black Jews in Ethiopia. It talks about all the stuff that he's talking about. So I've got a few contacts that I've worked, but I'm trying to get it in front of him. But it's kind of like I wrote the book just perfectly for Ye, and he just doesn't know it yet. Maybe he's reading it. Who knows? But that wasn't your question. Your question was to introduce the book. It is a sweeping history of Ethiopia, which most Americans don't know much about Ethiopia. They probably know that it's a country in Africa. They don't know how it's any different from any of the other countries in Africa. Ethiopia has a 2,000-year Christian history. Hardly anybody knows that. It's arguably, and I think I prove in the book that it is, the oldest Christian empire. Before that, it was 1,000 years Jewish. And of course, we've got the Ethiopian eunuch story in Acts chapter 8, with, that cues us in on that because he was reading the book of Isaiah when he was trying to get understanding. And we also have the story of the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon. Ethiopians believe that they had a child. So it wasn't just a friendly visit with tea. And so we've got 1,000-year Jewish history. They claim to have the Ark of the Covenant. And they've had an emperor on the throne who claims to be in the line of Solomon. up until for like 3,000 years, up until 1975 when Haile Selassie was taken down. So there's just all these amazing things about Ethiopia that your average Christian in America doesn't know about. When I tell them those things I just told them, they suddenly perk up and they're like, wow, that's fantastic. I never knew that. Well, I didn't either until I got exposed to it and then started digging some things out. So it's a sweeping history of all those things. It also talks about recent history in terms of two different invasions from Europe, the largest invasions of Africa. One in 1890 by the Italians, another one followed up by Mussolini in the 1930s. Both invasions were repelled by the Ethiopians, and the Ethiopians continue to this day to be the only African country that has never been colonized, and they claim to never have been defeated by anyone ever in their, multi-thousand year history. They're mentioned in Genesis chapter 2 as Cush, so they've been around for a while.
It is very interesting, Dean, that you mentioned the fact that the modern African American person would like to see like a history beyond, say, the West Coast African slave trade, and the fact that their culture is so rich with music and dance and all these things which honestly are coming to the forefront today, at least from the 90s and 80s. And so it's a very musical culture, but as well as Kanye, of course, being a musician, a rapper himself, or Ye as he's known for now. Just wanted to mention the fact that, well, there is this identity for the Black African, I guess, the Black African world that goes far beyond, and not saying all sub-Saharan Africans are from Ethiopia, but there is this lost kingdom, as you mentioned, that has this ancient Judaic, like literal Hebrew lineage, Davidic, almost Davidic, you could say, that goes back all the way back to the Old Testament, to the BC, and of course in the AD they are deeply Christian and remain so. And I think just most modern African Americans simply either look by that, or maybe there is a certain almost conspiratorial attempt to sort of hide this history away from the Black African American community in a way, like hide their.
I don't know if it's conspiratorial or not, but it's definitely there. Most African Americans think that to go ancient they have to go Muslim. They don't realize that many centuries before Islam ever got to Africa, Christianity was very strong in Africa, in Ethiopia in particular. And the oldest Christian empire, as I said, and it was Kush. Ethiopia was one of the four great empires in the early, second, third, fourth century, along with Rome and a couple of others. So a very rich history that any African American should be quite proud of. I just don't think they're aware of it. I don't know if it's a conspiracy or not.
No, it's definitely one of those things, and there are in America there are some mission parishes that are doing a good job of revitalizing the legacy of African saints, and saints like Saint Moses the Ethiopian and John Jarada the Ethiopian eunuch, Saint Caleb of Axum, and others. But I think it's something interesting that on this podcast we've talked a lot about the martyrdom of Tsar Nicholas II and his family, and that being representing a true end of kind of the Roman Christian legacy, the fall of the Christian emperor, of the Constantinian legacy from Constantine to Tsar Nicholas II. And in many ways, I don't know if I've said it on the podcast before, but I view a similarity to that with Haile Selassie, when when the emperorship there finished, and like you said, the oldest Christian empire in the world, ceased to be an empire, and in some regard embraced, quote unquote liberal democracy. And I think that that said a lot about kind of how much globalism had kind of ascended over our world today. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Dean.
Well, I think it's a tragedy. 3,000 years is a long time. You start with Solomon and Sheba. They have a son named Menelik I. He brings an entourage of Israelite royalty back to Ethiopia, and they've had a Solomonic emperor on the throne nearly nonstop for 3,000 years. So it was a great tragedy when that ended in 1975. It could have continued on. My book has several chapters on Haile Selassie. He was a great man. He's actually somewhat like Solomon, ironically. The first half of his life was saintly. getting out to Christ and calling on God and defeating Mussolini and the powers that be. Second half of his life, not so much. He kind of strayed away. He didn't really stray away from his devout Christianity, but he became very control oriented. He became very paranoid. He didn't loosen the reins enough for the country to develop and grow. And he could have done some things. I'm not really a Democrat, but I'll say this as a nod to FDR. Some people say that FDR saved us from becoming communists because he brought in some of those programs and kind of allowed some freedom and some flexing that allowed us to sort of progress in a way that communism didn't overtake us. Whether that's true or not, you can use that analogy for Haile Selassie. He did, he kept things at a very strong monarchical micromanaging kind of level. He also kind of got too into himself. Anyway, a lot of things happened. Second half of his life, not so good. And the fruit for that, in large part, is shown in the fact that he was deposed, he was killed, he had no successor, and it was replaced by a bloody, genocidal, communistic regime.
Yeah, it does seem like in a lot of these nations, and you mentioned the 1970s, and I'm sure you know, Dean, like you've being a historian, all around the world, we've seen these monarchies. I guess you can say the major monarchies fell around the time of the First World War, and then you have all the monarchies which belong to, say, the second largest countries. I wouldn't say second world, so to speak, but all the, this Spain, for example, Spain being one of the countries that restored monarchy, but Greece, Ethiopia, Persia, all lost their dynasties around the 70s. It is interesting that Ethiopia, maybe falls under the radar as opposed to, say, something like the deposition of the Shah in Persia and Iran, and maybe the loss of monarchy in Greece and the coming to power of the junta and things like that. It does seem like there is this almost like a second wave of democratization after the 1920s in the 70s and 80s, and it's almost like it's hard to say if this is like a worldwide thing. Possibly it is. Maybe just maybe it's collateral damage from the Cold War, because notice both the USSR and the United States are both democratic in their own respective ways. One is liberal democratic, one is socialist democratic in a way, and they're both applying this pressure on all the monarchies in between. That's kind of how I had this view. Wouldn't you agree that there is a sort of coincidence there that all these monarchies begin falling in the 70s?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Certainly, there could be a zeitgeist that happened during those two periods, and we're the worst for it, but here we are.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's a very good point. Also, just the fact that the at least I'm not sure what the opposition to communism in Ethiopia, of course, after the fall of the monarchy, was first and foremost the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which was the local the local predominant religion at the time. And I suppose it was similar to in Russia, how after Tsar Nicholas II was deposed and then put into prison and executed, the only opposition to communism essentially was Orthodoxy, which took the brunt of the hit. Could you tell us a bit of how the communists exactly interacted with the Orthodox reigning church in Ethiopia at the time?
They persecuted him and killed him. And when they were finally overtaken by the Northern Tigray People's Liberation Front, 15 years later, early 90s, I guess. Then the church was no longer persecuted, and so that was a good freedom, relief effort. Just a couple things I want to make a note of. The Orthodox Church in Ethiopia is vibrant and strong. Around half the country is Orthodox Christian. Then you've got about 35% Muslim. Almost all the rest are Protestant, with maybe a 1% Catholic. So it is a very strong Orthodox country. Now, when I visited the first time, of course, all the times I visited, but I was especially taken aback the first time, the churches are full. The churches are overflowing with people, and they're young people, bursting. Thousands of people in any one church, and they have these processions, and they're there for hours. I really, my jaw was hanging on the ground. I've been a zealous Christian in America all my life. I've never seen anything like it. It's very encouraging. My book, the premise of my book, there's several premises, but the main premise of the book is that Africa is the continent of the future because of birth rates. Just to tell you a little story, I got one of the reasons I wrote the book is I got to praying one day. I'd read Pat Buchanan's book, The Death of the West, which pretty much makes a impeccable case for the West dying because of birth rates, and Asia and particularly Africa is where things will be. And so I started praying, and I was like, well, Lord, where's the future of Christianity if it's nowhere in the West? So I took an inventory of nations. So I was like, well, there's Russia. Well, Russia at that time had a birth rate of 1.1. Replacement is 2.1. And no one has ever recovered from a 1.3 low birth rate. So Russia was not a candidate for Christianity in the future. Greece has just as bad a problem with their birth rate. Well, I'd spent a summer in South Korea. A lot of Christians in South Korea, they're Protestant, but their birth rate plummeted from 6.1 down to 0.9. And so they've totally bought into the secular worldly thinking on birth control. So that wasn't any good. So I looked around South America, some of these Catholic countries. Maybe that's where the future is for Christianity. But all the Catholics have given it up too, and their birth rates are not high. Africa has an average birth rate of around 5 or 6 children per woman. It's the only place where you have that high birth rate. And so Ethiopia is the only historic Christian country in Africa. So after all that surveying and praying, I determined that the future of Christianity and Christendom may very well be Ethiopia. So I felt like it was worthy of spending 3 or 4 years writing a book about it. And so that's how I got to where we are today. There's a huge full court press attempt by the United Nations, the Bill Gates Foundation, and all usual suspects to lower the birth rate in Africa and Ethiopia. All sorts of programs, abortion, birth control, conferences, grants, just all sorts of stuff. It's terrible. It's sinister and it's evil. My book talks about all these things. Basically, the book, because I use story structure, I write movie scripts, and I have a book, an unpublished book I've written on story structure. But the villain in the first third of the book is the Italians invading Ethiopia, trying to colonize it, with the largest European invasion of Africa in history, and a Ethiopian emperor named Menelik II, who's in the line of Solomon. He gathered together his forces and routed them, destroyed them. And this is like in the 1890s, and he became a household name across the world. He was on the cover of Harper's Magazine, which is the Time magazine of the day. Kids in America were named Menelik. It was an amazing thing. So that's the first third of the book. The second third of the book, the protagonist is Haile Selassie, who was squared up with Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, the famous dictator from Italy, and they have a long war. And I use that bit of conflict to kind of make my points and get information that I'm trying to get in and tell the stories and get the ancient history as well and weave in the ancient history. But the third part of the book is kind of a bait and switch on the liberals. And the third part of the book, the protagonist is Ethiopia and Africa and their high birth rates and how they're going to carry civilization into the future with a traditional morality. And the antagonist is Bill Gates. Bill Gates and what he represents, and the eugenics movement and the Planned Parenthood stuff that he's associated with, because his father was chairman of Planned Parenthood, and the connection with the United Nations efforts and all those sorts of things. So that's how the book kind of rolls out. But the premise is the future of the world is Africa because of birth rates. Ethiopia is the cultural leader of Africa because it's the only one with an ancient script, ancient Christianity. And so here we are.
No, I think that's I think Bill Gates is an enemy of this podcast as well. We can very much agree with that. And I think, and so much of that is, there's so much to unpack this book. I really want to read the entire book, and we're gonna have it linked in the description below. If they're listening on Substack or YouTube, we'll have it linked. But I want to ask
There's
Dean.
an audio. There's
You
an
talked
audio
about the
book.
Tigray. Awesome, awesome. You talked about the Tigray Liberation Front. That name sounds familiar to anybody who may be paying a bit of attention to the current conflict that's a bit wrapped up. But I want to preface my question a little bit. When I first started paying attention, when I first heard about this conflict, was when there was a big massacre. I believe this was a few years back at a monastery somewhere in Ethiopia. It may have been where I believe they say the Ark of the Covenant is. And so if you could maybe explain a bit of the current conflict, that's what its status is, maybe what it's about, and don't be afraid to tie in any of the, archaeological or metaphysical or religious, ideas and claims. We don't separate those two ideas on this podcast. So I just love to hear if you could break that down for the audience a bit.
Yeah. Well, there's a ongoing civil war in Ethiopia. Been going on for what, 3 or 4 years. It has possibly getting close to a peace agreement. There's been talk and chatter. We don't know yet. It's a tragic development, although there's a part of me that wonders if God brought it along to spare them from getting the vaccine. But Tigray is the ancient portion of modern Ethiopia where all these things took place that I've been talking about and the book talks about. The capital, or the capital's Mekelle, but the ancient kind of Jerusalem city of Tigray is Aksum. I've been there several times, and they do have a church there that claims to have the Ark of the Covenant in it. Ethiopia has like 70 tribes and dialects. So Tigray is one of those 70. Tigray is, I think it's about 5 million. Ethiopia is 110 million. It's the second largest country in Africa. There is, I think the largest tribe is called the Oromo, and they're like half Muslim, half Christian. There's the Amara, which are largely Christian, but there's a lot of the tribes, which are kind of like states. They would be Muslim. Some of them are majority Christian. Most of the Christian ones have a low birth rate right now, which is alarming. The Muslims continue to have children, and they tell the UN and Bill Gates to take a hike. So the UN and Bill Gates put more time on the Christians. They feel like they can make more progress. Tigray has one of the higher birth rates. I'm very excited about that, and I hope they can keep it. But it's a hard fight, and it's a hard battle. The communists took over in 1975, as we said. There was a horrible coup. There was a bloody genocide of over 1 million Ethiopians. Finally, they were defeated under the leadership of the Tigray People's Leadership Front, TPLF. And, the country was thrilled to get rid of this evil dictator, this genocidal regime. But the new regime was, it was authoritarian. And what they say, sometimes you need a strong man in certain situations to hold things together. And Meles, that was the name of the leader. He was able to hold the country together. He died after about 12 years, and after he died, the kind of the bonds kind of dissolved, and so the tribal divisions really reared their ugly head, and the Tigray or TPLF political party still held a lot of power, and they held it in some authoritarian ways, and the other tribes started to resent it, and they were finally voted out, and they got a new leader finally that was not from Tigray. That's the present Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, who is a very fascinating and strange character. I'm not sure what to think of him, but one of the things that was happening is that all these churches were getting burned down by Muslims, and priests were being killed, and it didn't seem like the Abiy regime was doing enough about it. I think that was one of the struggling problems. But anyway, one thing led to another, and war broke out when Tigray tried to elect their own leaders, and the Abiy regime didn't recognize that, and that was sort of led to the present conflict. It depends on who you talk to. I've got Ethiopian friends on both sides of the aisle, and they are very, very virulently opinionated on their side of the aisle. And there's a lot of propaganda going around. So I don't know that I'm an expert on it, but unfortunately, I know probably more than just about anybody.
Well, Dean, I want to, maybe cut through a bit of the BS that I know, because it's one of those. I'm not an Ethiopia expert by any means. I like to on Twitter. I style myself semi-ironically as a World War III analyst, and I think this front, especially as someone who's analyzing, I believe Christianity is at the center of a lot of these, worldwide events. Whether it's like you talk about depopulation agenda or, the satanic, I think push into Ukraine against Russia, but I believe in Ethiopia, I've had a hard time kind of juggling narratives and juggling what's going on when it comes to, because on the one hand, it seems that the Tigray region is a bastion of Christianity, and ostensibly Abiy Ahmed is more in line perhaps with the Muslim factions. But at the same time, I've seen evidence and heard people talking about the Tigray forces being funded by the West, being funded by the US to disrupt perhaps a more independent, Abiy regime. The African Union, I believe, is centered in Addis Ababa, which was started by Muammar Gaddafi, who you mentioned Ahmed being a bit of a crazy character. Gaddafi himself being a very, interesting, fascinating character who ultimately was, murdered by the U.S. regime for better or for worse, for maybe paving a new path forward. I'm wondering, could you maybe give us a perspective on, not saying you tell us which side is good or bad as it would be, but maybe give a perspective on the international factions aligning and, maybe the Christian perspective on the ground.
Yeah. First, I'll just tell you about that. My natural inclination is to go towards a religious struggle. And I want it to be a religious struggle in some ways, because that's territory that I understand a little bit better, and it would make it easier to understand it that way. And so I've tried to sort of shoehorn it into a Christianity versus Islam or Christianity versus secularism kind of battle. I haven't been able to successfully pull that off. I'm not sure that is what's behind it. It's got to be a factor. Tigray is the ancient Christian strong house power of Ethiopia, but Orthodox Christianity is vibrant and strong in Addis Ababa and in many other parts of Ethiopia. So you can't really slice it that way, I don't think, but I think it's a factor. I am also reluctant to say that it looks to me, whenever say the U.S. has been quite involved in trying to help Tigray. And so whenever the U.S. is doing dirty deeds in foreign countries, you always have to, have an eye of suspicion. What are they up to?
Yes.
What is their motive, and why are they doing this? And I think a plausible answer to that is that Ethiopia, like many other African countries right now, has been aligning itself a lot with China and Russia. And as we know, the larger battle in our world right now is the West versus the BRICS. And China is very involved in Ethiopia, very involved in building infrastructure and dams and roads and, trains and all sorts of things. I saw it firsthand when I was there several times. And I don't think the U.S. does not like that. And so I would not be surprised if their empowerment of Tigray is motivated to destabilize the country that they don't like, kind of moving off the reservation. That doesn't mean Tigray's ultimate reasons for trying to gain back leadership of Ethiopia is wrong, but it certainly could mean that part of their help comes from ulterior motives.
And for those of you who may not understand, any listeners, what BRICS are, like Dean just mentioned, BRICS is a very important acronym. Like, we're going to hear it more and more in this upcoming multipolar world, which we're sort of, this unipolarity is breaking down and we're becoming a lot more widespread. So BRICS essentially stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. At least 30, 20 years ago, these were the 5 leading economies of the, so to speak, upcoming world, the second-rate economies, which were, contending with the primacy of the United States. The United States having the largest economy and still to this day, the richest nation in the world. But of course, these next nations would form this, I suppose, an unofficial conglomerate group, which gets together and, the leaders of these countries, as well as, some of the economic ministers, they do discuss matters pertaining to the future of, the multipolar world and how all these various nations will interact among themselves. So BRICS, of course, is an important abbreviation. Now, what's also key here is BRICS, of course, has only 5 member nations, but there are other countries which want to get involved as well. So the abbreviation BRICS is, it sounds very nice, but it may also include, for example, Dean mentioned Ethiopia would of course love to become a member of BRICS. So maybe it's slightly far away from that now. At the moment there's conflict going on, but other countries such as Iran, for example, maybe not Saudi Arabia, but there are nations which want to get involved and kind of contest with the United States for economic primacy around the world.
Key swing pieces right now are Turkey. Turkey seems to be moving towards the BRICS and away from the West. Saudi Arabia is starting to look and smell like it's starting to make that turn. Maybe the biggest chess piece on the table right now is India, which seems to be aligning with the BRICS as well. So that's really that whole thing is really what the storyline is on the largest, kind of global storyline is when that alliance can basically develop its own monetary system apart from the dollar, and and basically disallow the U.S. from being able to have such a huge military because it has the world reserve currency.
Yeah, very well spoken. And just as you mentioned, like the fact that, you like to view it through a religious lens, and I completely agree. And kind of maybe in my amateurish way, I do see Ethiopia as, being between sort of the Horn of Africa and Egypt, and amidst all these great, really populous Muslim nations. And right across the Red Sea, frankly, is the Hijaz, and you have the Arabic Peninsula. So in a way, but you were just saying the population of Ethiopia is so great. It has literally a larger population than all of the Arabic nations combined in that Hijaz area, in that Arabic Peninsula, which I think people don't really they don't see Ethiopia as a counterbalance maybe to the Muslim world in that area, but it really is. It could be a future, say, counterbalance to the power of Egypt, the power of Saudi Arabia, which, as we know, Saudi Arabia is an even closer ally of the United States than Ethiopia is. So yeah, sure, Tigray may be cooperating with the State Department in some respects, but nothing like the cooperation between, say, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the US, which have these long-term military deals of uncomparable scale and size.
Correct.
Yeah, and also another thing, that geographically people may, just bring up a map of Ethiopia, and you notice that Ethiopia, it seems that its singular weakness seems to be the access to the sea. It does seem to be landlocked for whatever historical reason. It doesn't seem to have access to the Red Sea, which, of course, comes into the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, which, of course, this is key to world trade. And Ethiopia having such the largest military in Africa, having as you mentioned, second largest population in Africa, not having access to that really key sea it's almost like a not providential, but it seems like a stifling, it seems that this needs to be resolved in some way, similar to how Serbia at the moment doesn't really have access to the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. It's a little bit bizarre.
Yeah, I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade. I do know that Ethiopia, one of the ways they've addressed that problem is they've developed the largest airline in Africa, Ethiopian Air, and so they're able to do a lot of trade and shipping and stuff via air as opposed to shipping.
I've experienced the largeness of Ethiopian Airlines. I was once in a Turkish air lounge, and half of the flight calls were for Ethiopian Airlines, which I thought was very interesting. But when it comes to Ethiopia, I know they have had a historic relationship in the struggle against Eritrea, who is also a Oriental Orthodox country. For those who may not be Orthodox listening, Ethiopian Orthodoxy is not currently in communion with Russian, other Eastern Orthodox communities, Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Antiochian Orthodoxy, as they are what we call non-Chalcedonians. They reject the Council of Chalcedon, which occurred a long, long time ago, before even the Great Schism. I believe it was in the 6th century. And
430, I think.
Or was it the 5th century? Yeah. You're correct.
450.
And they are
This was 430, maybe.
yeah. So yeah, Dean, if you could maybe, when it comes to all that kind of stuff, maybe break down the relationship between, or Eritrea and Ethiopia as both, Christian nations, and then you could tell us a bit about the Ark of the Covenant and what you think about it.
All right, two very different topics. First
sorry,
of all,
sorry.
that's all right. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and I got to spend time with the leaders of the largest seminary, Orthodox seminary in Ethiopia. One of the key figures in my book that I interviewed was the head dean of the largest seminary, and I also got to spend time with the second highest person there at the seminary, who was actually from India. And he is now the head of the largest seminary in southern India. So I got to know these guys, and I know a little bit about it. They have a good relationship with Russia. There has been many back and forths of Russian Orthodox clergy and Ethiopian Orthodox clergy, and so that's a good thing. Technically not in communion. We've talked about this at length, and I talk about it in my book for a few pages. I don't go into it too much. I think people could only handle so much, but they talk about functional unity as opposed to technical unity. And so there is a desire to have functional unity with the Eastern Orthodox, but we aren't in formal technical unity with them. I actually got a hour-long podcast with my bishop, Archbishop Alexander, who talks about these things at length. It's a fascinating interview. But Eritrea is in communion with Eritrean Church is in communion with the Ethiopian Church. I think at least they are all the same thing for a while. Then they got separated politically. That was a bloody mess. One of the unfortunate parts about Eritrea is that they're majority Islam now, and they've got a lot of influences that aren't good like that have caused problems, and they're kind of one of the most tyrannical countries on earth right now. So Eritrea, as far as I'm concerned, have got a lot of problems and a lot of good things. Now you're going to come across Eritrean Orthodox Christians in America, and if they heard me say that, they would be furious. But that's just my take on it. Ark of the Covenant. The Ethiopian Church has a very sacred document for them. It's called the Kibra Nagast. It's the story of the Ark of the Covenant being taken from Israel by Solomon's son, Menelik, from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. It's a fascinating tale of it sort of being stolen in the night, and they fled away and ran away, kind of like Moses fleeing from the Egyptians. And it's a rather interesting story. Kind of, a lot of people kind of like levitating over the Red Sea, and a lot of things that would make it hard for some people to believe in it. I don't have necessarily a problem because I'm not a modernist. I'm open to miraculous activity, but technically, the Kibra Nagast is not scripture for the Ethiopians. It's just a very revered book. It's kind of their what would be somewhere kind of between a story between their George Washington story, our George Washington story, and our Knights of the Round Table story. It's kind of legend, kind of historical, but they take it very seriously. And all Ethiopians believe the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia, and most Ethiopians believe the Kibra-Nagast story. Where I land in the book, I don't want to tell you too much, but I do believe that Solomon and Sheba had a son, and that he went back to see his father in Israel and brought a retinue of Israelite leaders with him to establish the Jewish faith, the Old Testament faith, and the Solomonic Davidic monarchy in Ethiopia. I do believe that happened. I've got reasons to believe that the Ark of the Covenant didn't get there for another 300 or 400 years. So I don't believe the Kibra-Nagast story in whole. I believe parts of it. I do believe the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia today.
That's fascinating. And I think Graham Hancock, who's in the news recently, some of his work, I know he has something in the past about Ethiopia. So he's written, I think, about the Ark of the Covenant. So that's like big in the news today with his Netflix special. I don't know if it touches on that exactly, but is it?
I deal with
tradition
Graham
that says
Hancock quite a bit. I deal with his what's the title of his book? The Something in the Seal. But it's all about the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia, and he's got a theory of how the Ark got to Ethiopia that I think is pretty strong, and I use that quite a bit. But I also deal with Graham Hancock as a person. I have fun with him and kind of pit him against other scholars, and there's things he gets right and there's things he gets wrong, and there's reasons why he gets persecuted that are not valid, and there's reasons that are valid. He's a fascinating character, but I think he ends up coming out smelling pretty good in my book, but he doesn't go unscathed.
well, maybe next year we'll have you and Graham on the show for a roundtable discussion. If you're listening, Graham, let's have it. But Dean, I think that's all fascinating. I want to get brief. I'm sorry if I'm packing these questions with too many disparate questions. I think you're a wealth of knowledge, but I think I wanted to maybe get a quick response from you, maybe on what would someone who would say that the Ark of the Covenant supposedly in Mount Tabor.
Well, the reason I can't believe that the Ark of the Covenant came in 1000 BC from Solomon's son to Ethiopia, which is what the Kibra-Nagast claims, is because I'm a Eastern Orthodox Christian, and Maccabees is part of our canon. Maccabees is scripture, and in Second Maccabees it says that Jeremiah took the Ark of the Covenant and swifted it away from Jerusalem and put it in a cave on Mount Sinai. So you said Tabor, and I get confused if they're the same mountain or a different mountain. And I'm pretty sure that Maccabees says Sinai and not Tabor, but been a couple of years since
I believe you're right that it is on Sinai. I just probably misspoke.
Okay, but because of that, I don't have a choice. I have to believe that because I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. Now the Ethiopians have all the same books that we do in the canon, except for, take a guess.
Maccabees.
They have a different kind of retelling of that story. First, second, from Cuba or something. I forget what they call it, but they leave that part out. Anyway, so I'm forced to look for other ways that the Ark of the Covenant may have gotten to Ethiopia. That has to happen after about the 700s when Jeremiah lived.
Well, there's plenty of time between the 500 BC and roughly 1300 or 1400 when the legend of that journey was written. So I'm sure plenty of things could have happened. Just as Constantine and Helen, they did find the cross 300 years after Christ's crucifixion, which that's still quite a lengthy amount of time. So you never know how these things are, how these things eventuate. And of course, there was no prophecy of a Roman emperor finding Christ's cross. It just kind of by God's providence occurred 300 years after his crucifixion. So Christian history does have this interesting way of just occurring sort of before our very eyes. It's very alive, very much alive, I guess, in this new Anno Domini age in which we live.
It'd be just like God to have some obscure African nation have the art.
No, I think Ethiopia is fascinating. I really would love to visit someday. There's so many beautiful images, like, you know, they've got monasteries on pillars, you know, that rival Greece and these other places that are known for their, you
They've
know,
got more
majesty
monasteries.
on
They've got more
cities.
monasteries than any country in the world. They've got 1,000 monasteries.
Well, you know, through our prayers, perhaps they can accept Chalcedon, and we can all take communion at each other's churches in our lifetimes, you know, by the grace of God. But we could talk
One
about
day, I pray.
Ethiopia forever. Dean,
What's
I
that?
want to get maybe your final. I was saying we could talk about Ethiopia forever. I want to get your final thoughts on maybe two things. I want to get your thoughts. I know Ethiopia is perhaps entering a big struggle with even Egypt over the Nile River, which, I mean, there's all sorts of symbolism that we could get into there with their damming of the river and with all of that. So, I mean, I was maybe wondering if you had any thoughts on that. I was going to get your thoughts there, and if not, any final thoughts on the Ethiopian church, on, you know, the place of Ethiopia in the world. I'd love to hear it. Then we're gonna maybe ask you a bit of your thoughts on the current situation with Alex Jones and Ye.
Yeah, I don't have much to say about the Nile River and the dam. Those are geopolitical events that I don't think I have any expertise on. I'd be happy to talk about Alex and Ye and also the Ukraine conflict. I've got a lot to say about that.
Let's head right into that then. I'm thinking with I know Ye said all sorts of things that, you know, we talked about on the show that we would talk about for a while. You know, I think some people may be surprised to hear some of those. Some people heard things they may have heard for the first time. You know, some people that may have been paying a bit more attention. I encourage everybody read a lot of Dean did a great shout out of Pat Buchanan's Death of the West. I encourage people read Churchill, Hitler, The Unnecessary War, maybe a few other of his works before you angrily type something in our replies. But when it comes to Ye and Alex Jones, he talked about you know, Ethiopia. There was mention of Black Jews. I think Alex backed him up on some of that. There's a mention of, you know, there's been struggles with Israel and Ethiopian Jews and allowing them in and whatnot. And I think Dean makes a great point that Ye should read his book and, you know, maybe bring some of this kind of stuff to the fore. I want to, what you made that pitch at the beginning. I want to hear some more of your thoughts.
Well, you know, let's talk about what Ye's doing.
Hey everybody, Conrad here. Super sorry about this. We have to cut about 15-16 minutes out of the YouTube version of the interview. Don't worry, the full uncensored interview is up on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. It's episode 10 with Dean Arnold. Some fantastic stuff. We get into Ye on Alex Jones, and really, we don't hold back, so be sure to head over there if you want to hear the full thing. YouTube terms of service is annoying, so we hate it just as much as you guys. But with all that being said, there's a solid amount of content still left on the YouTube interview. And with all that, back to Dimitri.
I mean, most likely they'll do something even worse, but like shut down the entire, shut down entire monasteries, churches, and cathedrals. But they could simply take Russian priests and bishops to court for even having these materials. I think there's something to consider there.
Yeah, Lord have mercy. I hope it doesn't get to that, but I think that kind of stuff is already happening.
Dude, I'd love to get your thoughts on the Ukrainian situation, the Ukrainian persecution, and also want to use what we were just talking about as a bit of a segue, because we've mentioned G.M. Davis' book on the Antichrist on this in the past, and you actually have a new book coming out that's going to be about a, you know, partial preterist interpretation of Revelation, the Orthodox perspective on, you know, the book of Revelation and things like that. So I believe that there's a lot of parallels and things to be drawn with the current situation in Ukraine and things that could be, you know, seen as extreme Christian persecution. And that, of course, gets people thinking about the end times. And of course, we make no claims to know when the end times are on this show, but we have Dean here, so we want to get his thoughts on that.
Yeah, a lot of things to talk about. Yeah, I am working on a commentary on the book of Revelation. It's basically based on the works of a scholar named James Jordan. Anybody familiar with James Jordan? He's
I have heard of James Jordan before, yes.
yeah, he's a biblical commentator, biblical theology kind of a guy. I find him to be brilliant with his insights. And he had a stroke about 6 or 7 years ago, so he's not able to take his 204 lectures on Revelation and turn them into a book. And so he's given me legal permission to do that. And so that's what I'm working on. And the book is I would call it a partial preterist interpretation. That's a little misleading. I would call it a partial preterist emphasis, because Jordan, and he probably represents most partial preterists, Jordan believes that Revelation has double fulfillment, if not multiple fulfillment, but certainly the two primary fulfillments of Revelation are the end times. We all know about that one. And the other major fulfillment is the near fulfillment. All prophecies have near fulfillments and far fulfillments. And the near fulfillment of the book of Revelation is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which completely ended the old order, the old creation, and brought in the new heavens and the new earth, quote unquote, which is the church. And so when you look at the book of Revelation and its symbolism, you can actually make sense of it and plug and play the various characters and things that happen in the dramatic events, starting with Christ and leading up to the destruction of his enemies and the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And that is, it's just rich stuff. It's really phenomenal stuff. We're not saying that the book of Revelation doesn't also talk about the end times. It does. It's a mystical book. It's written by the Holy Spirit, and it has layers and layers and layers of interpretation. But personally, it doesn't mean it's not the case. I just don't think that the end is going to happen in the next 100 years. I think it's going to be a few hundred, if not a couple thousand. And I think we're still in this long phase, just like Christians were in the 1700s and the 1200s and the 700s and the 400s. And so it's a little hard for us to really get at what the Revelation means in terms of the ultimate fulfillment. It probably isn't relevant I think, to current events in that way. That's a letdown for people. They're like, oh man, I want to read Revelation and I want it to talk about Gog and Magog, and that's Russia and Iran and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you just spend most of your time talking about the near fulfillment, which is AD 70 and all the incredible events that happened both with Rome and the Roman Empire and Jerusalem and the temple and Christianity, the depths. There's so much to talk about, and it's so edifying, it's so fulfilling. And so that's what I'll be talking about with that. That's something that makes sense, that you can make sense of it. It's logical, it's rational, it's plausible. People can buy into it. The end time speculation I find to be just too abstract. So when I first took on this project, I was just going to use James Jordan as kind of a one of my main scholars that I would quote, but I've decided to just make the whole book kind of about his take on everything. It's 1.6 million words, which I'm going to have to trim down to about 300,000 or 400,000. So there's plenty to talk about. But I also wanted to sort of make it like an orthodox interpretation. So I've read everything that's been written by any orthodox person about Revelation. Well, you know what? They don't say much.
Exactly. There isn't much written. Yeah.
You know why they don't say much? Because they're honest people. They're circumspect. They're not like Hal Lindsey and Tim LaHaye and all these wild-eyed people in modern times who are constantly talking about the end times and constantly being wrong. They're circumspect believers, and so they talk about Revelation in a very sort of abstract way. Well, this is what sort of the concept of the Antichrist means, and here's what he'll kind of do at some point. We don't know when. And so when you read these commentaries, there really isn't much there. But what there is a lot to say about, and it's biblical and it's documented and it makes sense and it's really cool, is the near fulfillment, which is how Revelation relates to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. So that's where I spend my time.
I already mentioned Saint Andre of Caesarea's commentary, but for any Orthodox listeners, as Dean said, if you read Saint Andrew's Andre's commentary on the Book of Revelations, you'll notice he's making a really he's making a big deal out of simply linking the Book of Revelations to the rest of Scripture. So it's mostly he explains things, but not in the way you would see maybe Protestant or very popular exegesis explain. Like, he doesn't actually give you his particular opinion on something. He just kind of links it to the rest of Scripture, which I think the Book of Revelation really, it does tie into the rest of Scripture perfectly, which is why it's canon in the church.
Yeah, but Andrew of Caesarea's commentary is really short because if you're circumspect, there's not a lot to say. He does a few times here and there nod towards the near fulfillment, and he talks about that just a bit. He mostly talks about later fulfillment, and since he's circumspect, he doesn't have a lot to say. And that's what I found with most of the Orthodox commentators.
No, I think it's fair. People need to do, if they haven't, done their research, and they need to look into, all the fascinating details around the destruction of the temple, under the emperor, and then even later histories that kind of mimic this. Like, I remember first learning and reading the documents about Julian the Apostate, and the similarities with some of what his collaboration, with the Jews at the time, and their attempt to rebuild the temple, and how he was, literally blown up from the earth, that, and then the similarities, which, how the temple wouldn't be rebuilt after it was destroyed until much later. It was very those things are so fascinating to people who love history, who love Christian history. Indeed,
yeah, there's that awesome story where they tried to rebuild the temple in, was it like 140? I think there was another time in like the 400s, but either one or both times, like fire from heaven came down and destroyed the whole project.
I think as most viewers will probably read and understand, just as many of you people, like whenever we pick up the Book of Revelations, it's you read it cover to cover, it's pretty captivating, and it's almost like it's very hard to understand for a person still learning about Christianity. Maybe it's even, I think, in catechism, in Orthodox catechism, when you're still coming into the church, it's not even recommended that the Book of Revelation is frankly read, because and we don't even, it's the only book in the church which we don't actually read at any liturgies or any prayer events in the church itself. It's scripture which is read as well, which is kept there, but it's kind of like a reading in private in a way. It's a document which you read about the future, but its particular role in church liturgics is not played down, but it's given its own important place in a way. As well as many texts in the Old Testament, frankly, are as well. Like, they're not exceptionally like present in say you attend an Orthodox Christian church and you expect a reading from Revelations or a mentioning of Revelations, but you won't exactly see it. You may see a couple of icons, or the priest may mention it at a sermon, but you won't hear prayers about it, hymns, or things of that nature, which is very interesting.
Yeah, so the number fulfillment is much more interesting. So, for example, Jordan and other commentators identify, you've got you got the sea beast, the land beast, and the image of the beast, which are kind of the three unholy trinities in the book of Revelation. And in biblical theology, or the imagery that Jordan's constantly hearkening unto, Israel is always associated with the land, and the Gentiles are always associated with the sea. And so the sea beast is Rome and the emperors and the whole Roman Empire of the time, which became Antichrist, particularly in AD 64, when Nero went from being pretty decent emperor to being a cruel, horrible, terrible, tyrannical killer and persecutor of Christians. And the land beast is Israel, which is now the enemy of Christ and the seducer of Christians and all that kind of stuff. And the image of the beast is Jordan really gets down to saying that really is the temple, overseen by the Herods and the high priests, which he says are the two horns. The land beast has two horns. The Herods and the high priests, and the land beast causes people to worship the image of the beast, which is this false temple that has been built and which is finally finished in AD 64. And when those two events happen, the burning of Rome, which Nero blamed on the Christians in AD 64, and then the final completion of the false heretical temple, where the high priest took his seat which sounds very familiar with passages in the epistles and what Christ talks about, the abomination of desolation, all those things. All that happens in AD 64. Then you got these 7 years of horrible persecution of Christians, and then you've got the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and you've got the end of the old created world, the end of Israel, the end of the old covenant, and the bringing in of the new covenant and the church and the new heavens and the new earth. Well, to me, that's a whole lot more interesting than all this speculation that, the land beast is, this country, and the sea beast is Russia, and, Iran, and, whatever the topic of the day is.
No, I completely agree. That being said, I find it very interesting, not in any kind of prophetic way that has anything to do with Revelation. I just think it's interesting that, Israel, the land beast, and then, the enemies of Israel ostensibly being the sea, you could kind of align that almost with a Spenglerian history or whatever, with, Russia being this kind of land empire and its enemy being Britain, the sea empire, with, imagining the Orthodox Empire as opposed to its enemies. Not saying that has anything to do with the end times. I just find the symbolism very interesting. But again, when it comes to the early the early church and the early history, is there any juicy details or some interesting when it comes to the abomination of desolation and things that maybe a Protestant audience, there are people that are dispensationalists, they might think they have this really interesting eschatology. If there's any details you might want to drop that might make them reconsider?
First thing I'd say is that you got to get over the letdown that when you're dealing with Revelation, you're not dealing with predicting the very end, because we don't know when that's going to happen. And neither did people living in the 1700s or the 1500s or the 1200s or the 700s. But, we all get all sorts of excitement, by reading the book of Romans or reading the book of Acts or reading the Gospels and getting all sorts of applications about how it affects us today. Why can't we do that with Revelation? Why does it suddenly have to just be a book that has nothing to do with history and what happened? And why can't the fulfillments of Revelation in history be something that's edifying and exciting and can guide us by example and application for things today? So I think that's the first thing I would encourage people on. Little anecdotes. I mean, the abomination of desolation basically means when Christ walked out of the temple, that's when the abomination of desolation took place. The temple became desolate because God was no longer in it. But it became particularly manifest when this false temple was fully completed in AD 64 by the Herod at that time, and the high priest took his seat in it, and Christ had nothing to do with it. It was an abomination of desolation.
Yeah, and just a quick mention, mentioning the abomination of desolation, but it's this. I guess just as we discussed of Jim Jatras on the previous podcast, this reappearance of, say, these miniature antichrists throughout history, figures such as Napoleon, being a super big Freemason, or Julian the Apostate, or these various figures throughout history, Lenin being an apostate from Orthodox Christianity, all these, even Nero himself, frankly, all of these almost these fulfillments of the Antichrist's role from Revelation appear throughout history, and also the abomination of desolation, like that in a sense, from an Orthodox perspective, would be Roman Catholicism, that is the Vatican, right? The the See of Peter has been abandoned in a way.
Those are all things to look at. I find it to be speculation, and I find it to be not as interesting because I don't think it's as solid. I think what Jesus has to say in Matthew 24 and what Revelation has to say is largely the prediction of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. That's solid. That's biblical. That's something we can lock into. It's not speculation, and that's something. Nero's name means in Hebrew letters. You add up the numbers, it's 166. Well, that's solid. That's not weird speculation. In terms of taking that and talking about current events, you can do it, and I'm not. But to me, it's along the lines of someone standing up in your gathering and saying, I just got a word from the Lord and I want to share it. Well, okay. I guess we'll listen, but who are you?
Yeah, I suppose I was just referring to the fact that, throughout history, for example, we have certain, just as with the church calendar, events repeat themselves in a way. Like every Christmas, Christmas occurs every year, and so does Easter, and there isn't an Easter which is more important, say, in 1991, rather than it's not no less important in 2023, for example. And in the same way, certain biblical events, they don't repeat themselves, but we see certain almost like icons of them, or like the Orthodox Church was comfortable enough to say, proclaim, for example, proclaim Julian the Apostate as this sort of, this figure of great evil, and so Saint Basil would pray for his, that God would take him away, sort of for his demise. And then, for example, when Napoleon was marching with his enormous army at Russia, with this, full of agnostics, essentially Protestants, Catholics, and atheists and Freemasons, that the Russian Orthodox Church synodally announced to the entire Russian Empire that, look, this is very eschatological in a sense, that we need to prepare. Napoleon, he is portraying himself as the Antichrist. We need to take this very seriously. Even though Napoleon wasn't the Antichrist, he was just a pretty wicked dude, or a very, a talented genius, but also...
No, I mean, I believe in repeating patterns, and I believe in multiple moments. I just believe that when you get at that level, it's a good bit of speculation. It's rather abstract. It's really not solid. But the first century is really solid. When Jesus says, "Some of you standing here will be here when I return," well, it's very solid to say that when he came in the clouds in judgment and destroyed all of the old covenant in AD 70, there were still some of those disciples living. That makes sense. That's solid. That is biblical. That is logical. That is interesting to me. The figures who talk about it, Jesus, Paul, John, these are people we can trust, who we know have a relationship with God and have some interesting things to say. When you take that same pattern of fulfillment and start talking about how it relates to Napoleon, and how it relates to the Vatican, and how it relates to current events today, it can be interesting. I just don't find it to be very solid.
I was just going to say, I was going to wrap it up with something we talked about earlier. I think it's important to have this interpretation as it's very much an antidote to an unfortunate strain of Christian eschatology we see, which has resulted in, a very, very Zionistic outlook from, modern American evangelicals. And I think if that's led to some unfortunate things that have happened today, I think through a silly and poor interpretation of the scriptures. So I hope that people can, get some enlightenment from Dean's book, and we'll be looking out for it. But yeah, Dean, is there anything that maybe you want to say before we sign off about all the things we talked about, and then we'll wrap it up?
No, that's about it. I love Ethiopia. I was really happy to do that project. I think Ethiopia is the land of God. That's what it was called back when it was Punt in the 3000 BC, 4000 BC. They all called it the land of God, and it's still the land of God. And it's just full of vibrant Orthodox churches, and it's a fascinating place. I'm very happy to be associated with it and be able to have spent time writing that book. I'm not sure exactly what Ethiopia's unique role is, but it has something to do with preserving things of the created order, kind of like we preserve bones in the Orthodox Church, relics, even though it's not the ultimate fulfillment, which is the resurrected body. It's the bones that are going to be transformed at some point. Ethiopia sort of preserves the larger relics, the Ark of the Covenant and the monarchy, the Solomonic monarchy, and all these kind of different things. God has used it as sort of a place for physical curating of physical things related to the kingdom of God. They'll all tell you themselves. They'll be the first ones to say that these things that they preserve are not the ultimate things. That the ultimate thing is Mary is the Ark of the Covenant, and Christ is the fulfillment of the Ark of the Covenant, and these kind of things. But nevertheless, God still has some sort of interest in preserving of the physical matter.
Amen.
They also believe the Garden of Eden is in Ethiopia, and I spent a chapter or two talking about that. I think it's a pretty plausible argument, and that's worth looking at as well.
Yeah,
Fish is
sorry.
mentioned in Genesis chapter 2 as being around the rivers of Eden.
Yeah, I've always had the suspicion that Eden was somewhere in that North Africa, Middle East region. And not just myself. Like I think it was lots of people wrote about this, but very interesting. I will actually read further into your book, Dean, and for all of Dean's books, the link to his website, which has all of his books as well as some of the other works he's done, and of course the future book and mention of it will be on the website. We'll link it in the description below the video. You'll find it, and of course we'll be tweeting about it as well. And Dean, how long exactly have you got left on the project? Now, not to speed you up here, but in due time. But what time frames are we looking at here?
I tell people 2 to 10 years, but probably closer to 2, probably.
Yeah. God bless. That's wonderful. We can't wait. Frankly, it's been a couple of years since someone from the Orthodox community has released a good work on Revelations, and I can't wait to actually dig my hands into it and get a new perspective on the matter.
Great. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Dean. We hope to maybe have you on the show in the future, because we could have talked about this, for a billion hours. But while you're here, everybody, be sure to subscribe to us on Substack, worldwarnow.substack.com. Like and subscribe wherever you're listening. Share this video with everybody you know. Like I said, we're going to have Dean's information below. Follow us on Twitter, _. Follow us on Telegram, _. Follow me on Twitter, GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri, O Canonist. We'll probably have Dean's Twitter linked as well. He has some great tweets. And with all of that, I want to thank everybody. This was a great conversation. And God bless.
God bless.
Thank you. Good, guys. It was a privilege.